This is the story of Guy Eby. Now, a lot of the time on this channel, I never look at the pilots flying the plane. I look at the accident itself. How the accident happened, what went wrong with the plane, what happened with the weather, that sort of thing. But sometimes a story comes along that's a pilot first story and plane second. This is one of those stories. It's the 26th of November 1975 and tri-jets are all the rage. An American Airlines DC10 with 205 people on board was making the flight from San Francisco to Newark in New Jersey. The flight had a stopover in Chicago. The plane landed with no issues, and before long, she was back in the air and started to climb out of Chicago. At the helm was Captain Guy Eby, born in Pennsylvania on the 9th of November 1918. Eby had flown all over the world, from fighting against Japan in World War II to being a part of the Berlin airlift. Guy Eby was as experienced as they came. Today's flight would be a cakewalk for him. On the radio, Chicago Center cleared Flight 182 all the way up to 37,000 feet. Chicago Center also cleared the jet to the Carleton BOR. 182 Heavy, Roger, direct Carleton BOR. Course contact, Cleveland Center 127.05. With that, American 182 changed over to Cleveland Center. Once on the Cleveland Center frequency, the flight was normal, nothing to report. If you're getting bored at this point, I don't blame you. This flight was normal, nothing was happening. Cleveland Center at this time was asking the pilots about the tops of the clouds. TWA 37 Cleveland, what are the tops? TWA 37 replied with, they're higher than we are, it's hard to say. You can see through it. It must be at least 37. The controller did the same thing with American 26. And eventually, the controller got to Guy Eby's DC-10. American 182 Cleveland, what is your altitude? American 182 passing through 347 at this time, and we can see the stars above us. But we're still in the area of the clouds, end quote. Instead of a thank you, the controller immediately snaps back with, American 182 descend immediately to 330. The pilots acknowledge and set the autopilot to 33,000 feet, and the plane starts to fall. Then they saw why. Through their cockpit windows, they could see flashing lights of another plane, a TWA L1011 right in front of them, and coming directly at them. Guy decides to take matters into his own hands, and he pushed the yoke forward as he willed his plane to descend. In the cabin, people and objects were thrown around as the DC-10 and the L1011 flew towards each other at unimaginable speeds. Flight attendants and service cars were pinned to the ceiling as Captain Eby tried to put as much space between him and the other jet. The planes missed each other by 100 feet. 3 seconds after it had begun, the ordeal was over. Once the jet stabilized at 33,000 feet, the captain needed to take stock of what had just happened and how his passengers were faring. It wasn't good. There were some injuries, and so they decided to divert to Wayne Metropolitan Airport in Detroit. The TWA L1011 was Flight 37, on the way from Philadelphia to LA with 114 people on board. The situation on the flight deck of the L1011 could not have been more different. The flight engineer thought that he had seen the lights of another plane, and the other pilots were like, did you? Because they themselves had not seen anything. So they continued their flight, and they talked about how the weather makes it hard to tell how far apart planes actually are. They only got to realize how close they were to disaster when they were on the ground. I wonder what kind of reaction they had when they learned that they were 3 seconds away from certain death. If the clouds had been thicker, it would have taken far longer for the crew of Flight 182 to see the L1011, and who knows what could have happened. So now the question becomes, how did something like this happen? At the time of the near miss, American 182 and TWA 37 were both under the jurisdiction of the Wayne sector of Cleveland Control. The Wayne sector was responsible for flights above 35,000 feet. As the planes entered the Wayne sector, they were painted by radar, and this was painted on a radar screen. On the radar screen, the display for each aircraft consisted of a symbol for the aircraft's position and a data block. The data block had the plane's identification, its assigned altitude, and in the case of American 182, the jet was climbing, so the data block also had the jet's actual altitude. All this data was updated every 12 seconds. At the Wayne section, control was managed by 2 individuals, a radar controller and a manual controller. A third controller who was assigned to the handoff position was at lunch, so this meant that the radar controller was pulling double duty, doing his job and the handoff controller's job. So what do these three guys do? The radar controller handles the radar control in the sector. He interfaces with the computer to insert certain traffic control functions into the computer. He can accept a target's track into a sector or transfer a target into another sector, and can also change a target's altitude or routing. The manual controller is the non-radar controller. He maintains the flight data for the flight progress strips, issues departure clearances, and coordinates with adjacent sectors and nearby ATC facilities. The handoff controller is right next to the radar controller and assists the radar controller with his duties and coordinates with adjacent sectors. On the day of the accident, TWA-37 showed up on the screen for the first time at 7:03 p.m. and it showed that the jet was at 35,000 feet. TWA-37 was 105 nautical miles from the Carleton Vortac and on a heading of 290 degrees. The Wayne radar controller accepted the jet from the adjoining sector at 7:03 p.m. Then they watched as the radar blip made its way across their screens. At 7:18 p.m., the Wayne radar controller entered the code into the keyboard to transfer TWA-37 to Chicago Center. At this point, the jet was 6 nautical miles east of Carleton. Minutes later, they were accepted by Chicago, but the jet still showed up on the radar screens at Wayne Center. On the other hand, American 182 showed up on Wayne Center screens at 7:14 p.m., climbing through 26,200 feet on a heading of 092 degrees. In this case, the Wayne Center controller accepted the target from Chicago Center. By 7:21 p.m., American 182 and TWA-37 were barreling towards each other, and they were closing in at over 850 knots. For context, that's about Mach 1.2. As the radar controller accepted American 182, he realized that there might be a traffic conflict with TWA-37, and they were headed right for each other. But he wasn't too worried as he observed that all of the planes climbing east out of Chicago leveled off well before there was any conflict with any westbound traffic. But he decided to keep an eye on the two jets just in case, and he could turn one of the planes should the need arise. Right as American Airlines 182 hit 28,000 feet, Chicago Center called him with a manual pointout and a handoff of a Learjet. The controller accepted the handoff, and for the next 5 minutes, he was trying to insert a change into the routing of the Learjet into his computer. Apparently, the planned route of the Learjet was nothing like its actual route. This required some work on the part of the controller. But as he did all of this, American 182 kept climbing. Meanwhile, the computer refused to accept the routing of the jet that the controller was giving it. The jet was flying from Chicago to London, Canada, and the Learjet was requesting a direct routing to London. Since this was a routing that would be under the jurisdiction of Toronto, the computer didn't let him do that. Usually at this point, the manual controller would be doing all of this, but since the manual controller was busy, he thought that he'd do the job himself. At this point, there were 11 targets on screen for the Wayne sector. This is when another handoff happens. The third controller came back from lunch and relieved the radar controller. We'll call the controller who came back controller number 2. As controller number 2 was brought up to speed, he was told about TWA-37 and the Learjet, but not about American 182. Then controller number 2 made his first transmission at 7:21 p.m. He did not continue working on the Learjet problem. He noticed that TWA-37 and American 182 were getting kind of close. He saw that TWA-37 was at 37,000 feet and American 182 was at 34,500 feet. Controller number 2 could not believe his eyes. His mind raced. Was there a lag in the data? Was the data that he was seeing be a couple of seconds old? So he queries American 182 for his altitude, and that's when he realized that what he was seeing was accurate. He orders them to descend immediately, averting what could have been one of the largest air crashes in American history. As the two radar tracks merged and then went their separate ways, the controllers were left wondering what had just happened. 2 days after the near miss, Cleveland Center sent a letter to all personnel stressing the importance of keeping vertical separation between converging aircraft. The letter also said that Cleveland Center had 20 errors in 1975, and 10 of those errors came from inadequate separation between aircraft. The really great thing is that one of the survivors of this incident, Bert Herman, tracked down Guy Eby, and they were able to have a couple of drinks together. Captain Eby passed away on the 30th of July, 2021. I'd like to end the video with a quote from his obituary. Quote, "Sometimes fate, or you can call it God, puts exactly the right man in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. For the passengers and crews on that cloudy day, Eby was that man." End quote. Clear skies and tailwinds, Captain.